You were never meant to hear this. The story I'm about to tell you was buried beneath layers of polite lies, sealed in the yellowed archives of Louisiana, and whispered only in the private diaries of men who knew what would happen if the truth ever escaped. What you're about to hear isn't just a scandal, it's a curse, a chain of blood and betrayal that poisoned an entire generation. Imagine this: a marriage certificate, brittle with age, still locked in a state archive. At the top, the signature of a wealthy white plantation owner. And beneath it, in letters smaller than property deeds, the name of a woman who was never meant to be considered human. She was his slave, his cook, his possession. Yet, on a humid night in March of 1854, Jeremiah Aldrich, the master of Willowbrook Plantation, married her in a ceremony that was less love than spectacle. A grotesque wager. A bet made between men of power who thought nothing of turning human lives into punchlines. But here's the part they never put in the history books. In the 6 months that followed that unholy wedding, 13 people died on Willowbrook soil. Some in their sleep, some by fire. Some simply vanished, their names erased from ledgers, their bodies never found. Local newspapers hinted at plague, at scandal, at a curse that haunted Aldrich's home. But the deeper accounts, the ones pulled from private collections and silenced testimonies, speak of something else. A pattern. A deliberate sequence of events that tied back not to chance, but to vengeance. For a century and a half, polite historians dismissed it all as rumor. But the more you dig, the clearer it becomes. Jeremiah Aldrich did not simply marry his enslaved cook on a drunken dare. He entered into a pact of humiliation, arrogance, and blood. A pact that unraveled the veil hiding Louisiana's most corrupt families. This is not a love story. It's not even a tragedy. It's a descent. A slow drowning into the rot that lay beneath the sugar wealth of the South. And once you see the truth, once you step into the shadows of Willowbrook, you will not come back the same. Because this isn't just history. This is the anatomy of control. And tonight, you learn how the game was always rigged. Jeremiah Aldrich was not born into power. He wasn't one of the silk-loved Creoles who inherited sugar fortunes and grand estates along the river. He was the son of failure, a Kentucky tobacco farmer who drank away his land until there was nothing left but debts and a hungry boy watching him rot. By the time Jeremiah came of age, all he had was ambition sharpened by humiliation. And in the South of the 1830s, ambition had only one real currency: flesh. When he arrived in New Orleans in 1839, he didn't carry lineage or honor, only hunger. The city was swollen with river traffic. The smell of rotting cane and spilled blood from auctions held in courtyards where marble floors echoed the cries of the sold. This was the perfect place for a man with no scruples. He slipped quickly into the shadows of trade. The kind of business no gentleman wanted to touch, but every gentleman profited from. By 1840, Aldrich had found men as desperate as himself. Marcus DeVoe, the last son of a sugar dynasty crumbling under creditors. Samuel Rochelle, a ship captain ruined by fever and gambling debts. Together, they created the Delta Trading Company. Its warehouses stood on the edge of the river like silent tombs, filled with cargo nobody dared list on official manifests. Escaped slaves, recaptured in midnight hunts, free men of color kidnapped off the docks, smuggled captives pulled across the Atlantic, even after the trade was outlawed. The profit margins were obscene. For 3 years, money poured in faster than they could launder it. They bought respectability like it was another commodity: houses, plantations, the right clothes, the right company. Aldrich himself purchased Willowbrook Plantation. A grand house with white columns he filled with stolen wealth and false paintings of ancestors that never existed. To the untrained eye, he looked like every other Louisiana planter. But behind the facade lay the rot, a man who had built his throne not on cotton or cane, but on shadows and broken bodies. And this is where the truth becomes useful to you. Because every empire built on corruption carries its own seeds of collapse. Every false king eventually faces the weight of the ghosts he tried to bury. Aldrich thought himself untouchable. What he didn't understand was this: Men who rise by betrayal are always hunted by the very systems they exploit. It was only a matter of time before cracks formed in his empire of misery. And when they did, the fall was bloodier than he could ever imagine. Success breeds arrogance, and arrogance is the mask that slips before the kill. By 1843, the Delta Trading Company was a machine of profit, grinding human misery into gold. But prosperity came with attention, and whispers had begun to reach federal marshals about illegal shipments moving along the Gulf. Dockside records were being examined. Freedmen were talking. Questions were spreading through New Orleans like the smoke of a fire no one wanted to admit was burning. Aldrich gathered his partners in Willowbrook's study, a room lined with leather-bound books he couldn't read, and portraits of men who weren't his blood. He poured them whiskey and listened to their fear. Marcus Devo wanted out, ready to dissolve the company and burn every ledger before the marshals closed in. Rochelle, ever the sailor, argued for patience, a transfer of assets overseas until the heat cooled. But Aldrich sat silent, cold calculation gnawing at his brain. These men weren't allies anymore. They were liabilities. Loose ends. Witnesses with mouths that could bury him. And so he made a decision, the kind only the truly damned can make. He would not cut ties. He would cut throats. The plan was simple, elegant in its cruelty. He invited them to a warehouse meeting on the docks, under the guise of one final strategy session. He arrived first, a pistol hidden in his coat, a knife sheathed in his boot, and false witnesses already primed with lies about partners quarreling over stolen money. Every detail rehearsed like theater, every move rehearsed in silence. The moment came swiftly. A gunshot ripped through the whiskey-soaked air, and Marcus Devo fell back with a crimson bloom spreading across his chest. Rochelle fought harder, older, but desperate, slashing Aldrich's cheek open with a broken bottle. They tumbled among crates and spilled ledgers, their blood soaking into the very records of their sins. But brute strength and pure malice tipped the balance. Aldrich drove the knife home, twisting it until Rochelle's breath rattled into silence. He staged the scene like a playwright of death. Bodies arranged to look like rivals who had destroyed each other in greed. Scattered coins. Broken furniture. Paid witnesses swore to hearing shouts and gunfire. By morning, the story was complete. A tragic business dispute, with Aldrich the sole survivor. And just like that, he inherited everything. Their ships, their gold, their silence. What he didn't inherit or even notice were the eyes watching him. The relatives who smelled the rot in his story, the sons and brothers who would remember and who would wait. For the outside world, Jeremiah Aldrich emerged from tragedy as a survivor. Newspapers called him fortunate, even noble, for enduring the violent deaths of his partners. Banks welcomed him as the last standing pillar of their enterprise. In less than a month, he shifted assets, signed forged transfers, and became sole heir to the Delta fortune. It was blood money scrubbed clean with paperwork and sealed with handshakes. By the end of 1843, Aldrich had transformed himself. The failed farmer's son was now master of Willowbrook Plantation. Host 2 banquets where chandeliers glittered above polished floors, while enslaved servants carried trays of wine to men who spoke of honor with lips stained red. Aldrich bought paintings of ancestors he never had, lined his halls with oil portraits of invented nobility. His scarred cheek only added to his legend-whispered proof that he had survived treachery. A self-made man among old money. But success built on lies is a house with hollow beams. He never considered the shadows following him, the younger brothers, the sons, the survivors who knew the truth he had buried beneath whiskey and firelight. Marcus Devo's brother, Felipe, was no fool. He studied numbers, records, the kind of ledgers Aldrich thought destroyed. And Samuel, Rochelle's son, Henry. He had inherited his father's sailor's eyes, sharp enough to see what others ignored. Together, in secret, they began collecting evidence, knitting fragments of truth into a weapon. Aldrich, drunk on power, noticed nothing. He strutted through parlors, courted the attention of Louisiana's aristocracy. and invested recklessly, confident the river itself would bend to his ambition. He expanded Willowbrook, importing marble from Europe, commissioning columns meant to dwarf those of his neighbors. His wealth grew, but so did his appetites. Not satisfied with money, he craved humiliation, domination, the kind of pleasures whispered about behind closed doors. And here's where you must listen closely, because this is not just the story of one man's corruption. It is the anatomy of a system, a machinery of power that rewards betrayal, that cloaks violence in silk and silver. Men like Aldrich thrive not because they are brilliant, but because society is willing to look away while the banquet is served on the bones of the forgotten. He believed the past was buried. He believed ghosts don't keep ledgers. But the truth is simpler, darker. Every crime plants a seed, and every seed waits for its season. The season of vengeance was already taking root. While Aldrich filled Willowbrook with chandeliers and hollow laughter, two men sat in silence, sharpening patience like a blade. Philippe Deveau and Henry Rochelle. One an accountant with ink-stained fingers, the other a sailor with salt still in his blood. Both bound by loss, both hardened by the stench of betrayal. To the world, they were nobodies, a failed heir and a bastard son, but to each other, they were brothers forged in rage. They never spoke of justice. Justice was a word reserved for courts and men with powdered wigs who dined with Aldrich on weekends. What they sought was balance, to make the world feel the weight of its own rot. To strip Jeremiah Aldrich of the mask he wore and reveal the carrion beneath. It began with records. Felipe remembered every number his brother had ever touched. He pieced together ledgers from fragments salvaged out of river mud, cross-referenced shipments, and whispered with clerks who hated Aldrich's arrogance. Bit by bit, a shadow ledger took shape. Proof of human cargo smuggled after the trade was outlawed. Names of ships tied to deaths at sea, entries signed by Aldrich's own hand. Henry's part was quieter, crueler. Sailors gossip and ports remember. He traced every ship that had passed through Delta's docks. Listened to the drunken tales of deckhands who spoke of chained men hidden in holes, of women vanished on night runs. He bribed when needed, threatened when it failed, and when neither worked, he listened in silence until tongues loosened on their own. But revenge is never only paperwork and whispers. It is theater. It is patience. And both men understood that Aldrich's power rested not only in gold, but in reputation. He had crafted an illusion of nobility, a fortress of lies. To destroy him, they would not strike his body first. They would strike his story. So they seeded rumors. A drunken planter claiming Aldrich had cheated him. A servants whispered that Willowbrook's halls weren't haunted by ghosts, but by the screams of men Aldrich betrayed. Quiet, untraceable poison dropped into conversations at parties, in parlors, across taverns. At first, these whispers were dismissed, but whispers multiply. By the winter of 1844, even Aldrich's allies began to glance at him sideways, wondering how a man of no name had risen so fast, and why so many around him had died. Aldrich laughed it off, too blind to see the net tightening. He believed enemies were cowards who struck only in daylight. He never understood that true vengeance does not shout. It whispers. It waits. And when it arrives, it comes dressed as inevitability. By the summer of 1845, Willowbrook stood like a temple of false triumph, marble pillars gleaming against the Louisiana sun. Chandeliers spilling light onto floors polished so bright, they reflected a man's vanity back at him. To the casual eye, Jeremiah Aldrich had everything. Wealth, power, and a reputation sealed with the fear of others. But rot doesn't always show on the surface. Sometimes it gnaws in silence until the beams splinter without warning. It started small. A ledger misplaced, though Aldrich swore he had locked it himself. A servant whispering his name in a tone that carried contempt. A guest at a banquet who, after one glass too many, muttered, "Strange how many men around you end up dead." The room laughed it off, but Aldrich felt the weight of eyes lingering on him. At night, he began waking to noises. Footsteps across the veranda when no one was there. Doors left ajar he swore he had bolted. He dismissed it as the creaks of an old house, the wind pushing through the cane fields. But sleep turned brittle, and each dawn found him pacing halls with a pistol in hand, searching shadows for shapes that refused to stand still. More troubling still were the dreams. He dreamt of Marcus DeVoe with the hole in his chest still bleeding, of Rochelle's glassy eyes reflecting moonlight, of ships drifting downriver with chains rattling in empty holds. Sometimes he swore he smelled salt water in his bedchamber, damp and metallic, as if the river itself had risen to drown him. He told no one. Men of power cannot confess fear without feeding it. But fear has its own smell, and the house began to taste it. Servants moved quicker, avoiding his gaze. Guests declined invitations. Even his business partners grew cautious, suddenly hesitant to sign agreements too closely tied to his name. What Aldrich mistook for bad luck was the quiet success of whispers Felipe and Henry had seeded months earlier. His empire wasn't collapsing yet, but hairline cracks had formed in the facade. And once a facade cracks, it never truly repairs. Understand this: power is never lost in a single blow. It erodes, grain by grain, whisper by whisper, until the fortress is hollow and the king inside is a prisoner of his own paranoia. By the end of that year, Aldrich had stopped trusting his servants, stopped trusting his guests, stopped trusting the very silence of his home. He didn't realize yet that the silence itself was the weapon, and soon it would break him. By early 1846, Jeremiah Aldrich had become a man surrounded by ghosts, though all of them were still alive. That's the genius of vengeance. It doesn't always kill. Sometimes it simply cages, squeezes, makes the air too thin to breathe. Felipe DeVoe and Henry Rochelle understood this better than Aldrich ever could. Their war wasn't waged with bullets. It was waged with doubt. The first strike was a letter. No signature, no address, just a scrap of parchment slipped beneath the doors of Willowbrook in the dead of night. 4 words scrawled in a hand Aldrich recognized immediately: "We remember the river." He tore it to shreds, burned the pieces, but the handwriting, he swore it was Rochelle's, a dead man's script. Then came the whispers in the markets. Traders who once bowed now asked pointed questions. Why had Marcus DeVoe withdrawn so much money before his sudden quarrel? Why had Rochelle's ship docked with half its crew missing? Questions with no answers, only smoke that clung to Aldrich wherever he walked. At night, the theater grew darker. Henry had bribed servants small acts, simple acts. A mirror turned slightly in the parlor, so Aldrich swore he saw a figure standing behind him. A book pulled from a shelf and left open on his desk, the handwriting inside eerily close to DeVoe's ledger notes. Once, in the dining room, a candle sputtered out, and in the flicker, Aldrich thought he saw Rochelle's face across the table. By day, Felipe made the pressure official. Anonymous complaints reached marshals about shipments from Willowbrook docks. Numbers didn't align, signatures looked forged. Investigators visited, poked, left with polite words. But Aldrich noticed the shift. He was being watched. His name, once polished like marble, was now dragged through alley mud by men who never even met him. And here's what matters. When a man like Aldrich begins to doubt reality, he doesn't grow weaker. He grows dangerous. His servants now lived in terror. A misplaced glass could bring a lash. A stammered word could end in dismissal. Guests came less often, unsettled by his hollow eyes and sudden rages. Willowbrook was no longer a plantation. It was a stage for one man's unraveling, every corridor echoing with paranoia. Felipe and Henry didn't need to put a blade to his throat. They only needed to tighten the silence, feed the unease, and let Aldrich's own mind do the carving. And soon, the mask of the Southern gentleman would crack wide open, exposing the rot beneath for everyone to see. It was inevitable. A man can only bleed in the shadows for so long before the crowd smells iron. By the spring of 1847, Jeremiah Aldrich was no longer the polished host of Willowbrook's glittering soirees. He was a man flinching at shadows, snapping at whispers, trembling at ghosts. and Philippe and Henry were ready to rip away the last veil. The first blow landed at a charity gala in New Orleans. Aldrich arrived in his finest coat, determined to remind Louisiana's elite of his place among them. But waiting on the polished oak tables, slipped discreetly among the programs and invitations, were facsimiles of an old ledger page. Transactions in Aldrich's hand shipments, sales. Names of enslaved people moved illegally through the Delta. Every eye in the ballroom eventually found one of those pages. Every whisper became a dagger. He denied it, of course. Claimed it was forgery, slander. But the timing was perfect. His rivals, eager for cracks in his power, amplified the rumor. The room that once greeted him with deference now turned with suspicion. And in New Orleans society, suspicion was poison. Then came the duel. A young Creole nobleman, prideful and arrogant, accused Aldrich of cheating in a land sale. Normally, such disputes ended with pistols at dawn, honor restored, witnesses satisfied. But on that morning, as the two men faced each other across the levee, Aldrich's pistol misfired. The crowd gasped, and before he could reload, the nobleman's bullet tore through his thigh. He survived, but not his reputation. A man who couldn't defend his honor in a duel was no man at all. He limped from that field humiliated, bleeding not just from his wound, but from the collapse of the very identity he had built. Behind every humiliation, Felipe and Henry smiled from the shadows. They had forged the ledger copies. They had manipulated the land deal to provoke the duel. Every step was deliberate, each humiliation a stitch in a tapestry of ruin. But the most devastating strike came not from the elites, it came from his own household. Servants began to vanish, bribed or bought out. Accounts slipped into chaos. One night, his overseer, a man who had served him faithfully for a decade, disappeared with a trunk of plantation records. Days later, rumors spread that those records contained evidence of fraud, bribery, and stolen inheritances. Aldrich could feel it now, the walls of Willowbrook closing in. The laughter in the streets, not just behind his back, but in his face. He had wanted to stand among Louisiana's great men. Instead, he was being dragged into the gutter, clawing for dignity, while invisible hands pulled every thread loose. And still, Felipe and Henry hadn't even revealed themselves. By the winter of 1847, Jeremiah Aldrich was no longer a man in society. He was a husk, drifting through the ruins of his reputation. Willowbrook's fields lay untended, creditors circled like vultures, the grand halls of his mansion echoed with silence. What haunted him most was not the loss of wealth or standing, but the gnawing certainty that someone was orchestrating it all. This was no string of misfortunes. It was war. The revelation came one evening in New Orleans, when Aldrich staggered half-drunk into a riverside tavern. He was seeking escape, a corner of anonymity, a glass strong enough to drown the whispers. But instead, he overheard a conversation that froze the blood in his veins. Two dockhands, oblivious to his presence, spoke of a Devo boy and a Rochelle lawyer who were paying well for secrets about Willowbrook shipments. The names hit him like a hammer. Devo, Rochelle. The ghosts were not ghosts at all. They had children. They had bloodlines. And they had waited, biding their time, sharpening their knives in silence. Suddenly, the letters, the forged ledgers, the missing servants, all of it made sense. The sons had come for him. From that moment, paranoia turned to obsession. He doubled the guard at Willowbrook, though most had already deserted him. He slept with pistols under his pillow, pacing the halls at night like a caged animal, muttering to himself. Sometimes he would stop before the great mirror in his study and whisper, "I know it's you. I know you're watching." Felipe and Henry let him see just enough of their hand to deepen the madness. A calling card left on his desk, blank but edged in Rochelle's family crest. A page torn from a Devo ledger nailed to the door of his study. Even the servants who remained swore they saw men lurking at the tree line at dusk. Always too far to recognize, but close enough for Aldrich to know he was being hunted. And in the cruelest twist, his own allies abandoned him. Bankers revoked credit. Planters whispered that his dual failure had been divine punishment. A bishop who once blessed Willowbrook now crossed the street to avoid him. No one stood at his side. No one dared. That was when Aldrich finally understood the depth of his error. He had thought he'd killed Marcus DeVoe and Samuel Rochelle for money. In truth, he had birthed something far worse than debt or scandal. He had birthed vengeance that grew in silence, stronger with each passing year. Until now, it coiled around his throat like a serpent. And for the first time in his life, Jeremiah Aldrich felt something he had never allowed himself before. Not anger, not arrogance, fear. The end did not come with a bullet in the night or a dagger slipped between ribs. No, that would have been mercy. Philippe DeVoe and Henry Rochelle understood that true vengeance was not death itself, but the slow public unmasking of a man until he begged for death as release. In the spring of 1848, Willowbrook became a stage. Court summons arrived, forged but convincing, demanding Aldrich account for debts he had never incurred. Wagons appeared at his gates, men demanding payment for contracts he had never signed. He raged, he threatened, but each time the papers bore his signature, perfect forgeries crafted from years of studying his hand. By the time he protested his innocence, New Orleans already believed he was a fraud, a cheat, a swindler. The final blow came at a gathering of planters in Baton Rouge. Aldrich was lured, there by a promise of loans to save Willowbrook. He arrived, limping, gaunt, clutching ledgers, as if numbers could still defend him. The room fell silent as two figures stepped forward. Philippe DeVoe, Henry Rochelle, alive, grown, confident. The sons of the men Aldrich had slaughtered. In front of Louisiana's finest, they laid out the evidence, real and fabricated, of Aldrich's crimes. Illegal slave routes, murder, stolen fortunes, betrayals that reached back a decade. Page after page, witness after witness, each revelation stripping him bare. And the brilliance of it was this: the planters, those same men who had once toasted Aldrich's ambition, now nodded, whispered, believed. They saw not a gentleman, but a liar whose empire had been built on deceit. Aldrich snapped. He shouted, cursed, accused the two of forgery, conspiracy. But as he ranted, spittle flying, his scar glistening under the hall's lamps, something broke in the crowd. Laughter. They laughed at him, Jeremiah Aldrich, the great Willowbrook planter, reduced to a mad dog howling at ghosts. Humiliation finished what paranoia had begun. Days later, creditors seized Willowbrook. Servants fled. The grand house stood hollow, windows shattered by neglect, walls blackened by damp. Aldrich himself vanished into the swamps, muttering, raving, a pistol always clutched in his shaking hand. Some say he drowned in the Mississippi, swallowed by the river that had once carried his stolen wealth. Others whispered Philippe and Henry cornered him at last, delivering a private justice no record would ever show. What is certain is this: Jeremiah Aldrich never returned. His name rotted in silence, his legacy devoured by the very bloodlines he thought he had erased. And so the South whispered another lesson, a lesson men still fear to this day.
The sins you bury in flesh and blood will always rise again, carried by those who refuse to forget.